If you have a freshwater aquarium, it's more than likely that at some point a snail or two will suddenly appear in your tank. They can show up seemingly out of nowhere, but in all likelihood they got into your aquarium by hitching a ride on aquatic plants, either as eggs or as tiny snails. However, many people intentionally add snails to their tanks for the contributions that they can make to the overall health of an aquarium. But there are some drawbacks to having snails in your tank, so I'll go over both the pros and cons of keeping these amazing creatures. There are lots of different varieties of freshwater snails to choose from, and each one of them has a different set of pros and cons that you may want to consider. The most commonly seen snails in the aquarium hobby are Ramshorn snails, bladder snails, Malaysian trumpet snails, mystery snails, nearite snails, and assassin snails. And I'll cover all of them in detail in future chapters of this story, but for chapter 1 I'd like to focus on the Ramshorn snail, so let's dig right in and learn a whole lot more about these strange little creatures. They get their name from their flat, spiral-shaped shells that resembles a ram's horn. Their shells can come in 3 different colors: brown, white, or yellow, and some shells are even transparent. But the wild-type coloration of a ramshorn snail is brown to almost black. The body of the snail can also come in several different colors as well, such as brown, red, yellow, and even purple. And if that wasn't enough variation for you, some ramshorn snails also have spots. They have 2 tentacles, and at the base of each tentacle there's a very simple eye that's only capable of sensing light and dark. Unfortunately, this pink ramshorn snail is an albino, so the eyes are pink and difficult to see against the pink flesh of the snail's body. There's an eye right here and another one over here. The mouth of the snail contains a feeding structure known as a radula that's a little bit like a tongue that's covered in thousands of tiny teeth that are used for scraping away little bits of food which are then swallowed. The mouth isn't very strong, so snails prefer to eat things that are soft and easily broken down into smaller pieces. And since they're omnivorous scavengers, they have a diet that consists of just about anything soft enough for them to eat, but don't expect them to solve your algae problems. But if something in your aquarium dies, they'll rush right in to clean up the mess, and that's one of the useful things about having these snails in your tank, because they act as a cleanup crew that take care of any leftover food or dead tank mates. Be sure to notice the eyes on this spotted ramshorn snail. It's not an albino like the pink snail that I pointed out earlier, so its eyes are much more obvious. Ramshorn snails are able to survive in water that would be very poorly suited for a fish. But if the water is too acidic, such as when the pH drops below 7, the acidity of the water will start to eat away at their shells, causing pits and scars. This erosion of the shell mars the beauty of the snail, and in extreme cases can even cause health issues, so it's best to keep their water at a pH of 7 or higher. And that's not to say that they won't survive in more acidic water, but their shells won't look as nice. The other water parameter that can affect the health of their shell is the amount of calcium, both in the water and in their food, because their shell is composed of calcium carbonate for the most part. So they need calcium in their food as well as calcium in the water. If you have hard water, then you're golden, but if you have soft water, then adding crushed coral or cuttlebone to their tank can help provide the extra minerals that they need to grow a healthy shell. But it's important to note that a snail's mouth is not equipped to eat the cuttlebone, but it does dissolve in the water slowly, providing a much needed source of calcium. As far as food goes, some calcium-rich foods for your snails include blanched spinach, broccoli, and kale. But for those of you who are really into their snails, you could make a special snail food called Snello, which is made with unflavored gelatin, leafy green vegetables, and antacid tablets, which are made mostly of calcium carbonate. My mystery snails love my homemade Snello, and you can find lots of different recipes for how to make your own online. The pink Ramshorn snail seen here is eating some blanched spinach. Now, as far as providing aeration and water movement for your snails, you really don't have to do anything special, because Ramshorn snails are perfectly adapted for living in aquatic habitats where there's very little water movement and very little dissolved oxygen. So they have several adaptations that allow them to survive and even thrive in stagnant water that would be off limits to most other creatures. And one of those adaptations is that their blood uses iron to carry along the oxygen atoms through their bloodstream, while all other snails use copper instead, which is a much less efficient way of transporting oxygen to their cells. So the Ramshorn snail uses oxygen much more efficiently than other snails, and this iron in the blood of a Ramshorn snail is why their blood is red, just like ours, while the blood of all other snails has a bluish-green color to it, because they use copper to carry the oxygen atoms through the bloodstream rather than iron. Another amazing adaptation is that these snails can take in air from above the surface of the water, which allows them to live in habitats where there's very little dissolved oxygen. Now, let's take a look at how it's done. This Ramshorn snail has crawled to the surface and is about to take in a breath of air, and it does this by extending a little tube that comes out of a special opening on the left side of the snail called a pneumostome. And once this little tube is above the surface of the water, the snail pulls in air, which is then stored in a lung-like void inside the snail called the mantle cavity. But it's also sometimes referred to as a pallial cavity. The mantle cavity is lined with tiny blood vessels that can extract the oxygen from the air, at which point the oxygenated blood is then sent to the heart, which then pumps it to the rest of the body via the bloodstream. Watch closely as the mantle cavity is filled with air, forming a tiny bubble inside the snail. And here's another example of a tiny ramshorn snail pulling air into its mantle cavity. Ramshorn snails, mystery snails, and bladder snails are all referred to as pulmonated snails because of this lung-like chamber that they use to extract oxygen from the air. And now it's time for a quick commercial break because it helps me make a little bit of money. But we'll be back soon. Stick around, there's still a lot more cool stuff to see. Nonetheless, there are several other advantages to carrying around a little bubble of air. First of all, it makes the snail much more buoyant, so it's easier for it to move around with that big heavy shell on its back. And another way of looking at it is that the bubble of air acts a lot like a swim bladder on a fish. It just makes it much easier to move around in the water if you can float. And while many people think of snails as these slow and clumsy creatures, they are in fact very slow, but they're also incredibly graceful as well. Be sure to notice how the position of the air bubble up near the top of the shell keeps the snail in an upright position even when it's not attached to anything. And once again, you can see how the air bubble inside the snail performs some of the same functions as the swim bladder of a fish by keeping the snail balanced and in an upright position even when it's floating. Carrying around a little bubble of air inside your shell has other important advantages as well. And one of those advantages is that it helps these snails move quickly when they need to. Let's take a look. This ramshorn snail is floating at the surface, feeding on some decaying leaves, when along comes a dangerous predator that I like to call my index finger. The snail senses the threat and makes a rapid escape by releasing some of the air in its mantle cavity, which causes the snail to quickly sink to the bottom and away from danger. But there are some snails that refuse to believe that my index finger poses any threat, so they just float at the top, waiting for me to go away. On the other hand, that little bubble of air can also help these snails race up to the surface, and in order to do that, all they have to do is let go of whatever it is that they're holding on to, and then they float right to the top. Okay then, so you've seen how they get air from the surface and how there are several advantages to carrying around that little bubble of air. But they can also get their oxygen directly from the water with a special appendage called a pseudobranch. The pseudobranch is located on the left side of the snail, just like the pneumatophore that we looked at earlier. The pseudobranch is sometimes referred to as a false gill, and it can be a source of concern for some people when they first see it because they think that there might be something wrong with their snail. In some ramshorn snails, it can stick out so much that it's a real cause for concern, but this is perfectly normal. Nonetheless, the pseudobranch is lined with lots of tiny blood vessels right near the surface that can extract the oxygen from the water without the snail needing to surface for air. And here we can see three very important parts of the snail's anatomy. This is the pseudobranch that I just spoke about, and this is the pneumatophore that's used to take in air from above the surface. And this part right here is a genital pore that's used for breeding, and we'll get back to that when I discuss reproduction. All snails move around using a method of locomotion called ciliary gliding, which is the same method of movement that's used by planaria, as well as many other aquatic worms. And how it works is that the snail secretes a layer of mucus that's used to reduce friction as they crawl, but the actual movement itself is accomplished by lots of tiny hair-like structures known as cilia that line the bottom of the snail's foot. The cilia move together in a coordinated motion that allows these snails to glide over any surface. However, ciliary gliding is one of the most inefficient means of locomotion in the animal kingdom. So these snails need to eat almost constantly in order to keep up with the large amounts of energy needed for them to crawl around, and that's why you hardly ever see a ramshorn snail just sitting there doing nothing, because they're almost always on the move looking for more food. Nonetheless, the mucus secreted by the snail can act as either a lubricant or a glue, depending on what the snail needs at any given moment. Here you can see a ramshorn snail using ciliary gliding to crawl along the surface of the water, so they have no trouble feeding on floating flakes or pellets. And having that little bubble of air inside the shell helps them float right at the surface without any trouble at all. Here we can see a whole group of ramshorn snails floating on the surface and feeding on some flake food. And while we're on the subject of feeding, it's important to remember that lots of feeding leads to lots of breeding, which has caused the ramshorn snail to get a bad reputation amongst fish keepers. And this is especially true for those of us who tend to overfeed our fish, because the snails take advantage of the abundant food supply and then make lots and lots of babies. And in the right conditions, these snails can multiply so rapidly that they threaten to overwhelm the aquarium with snails. So it's important to remember that these snails multiply in direct proportion to their food supply, so the more food you put into the aquarium, the more snails you'll have. Ramshorn snails are hermaphrodites, which means that each snail has both male and female reproductive organs. Nonetheless, when these snails breed, they approach each other head-on, so that the left side of each snail comes into contact with its mate until their genital pores line up so that they can exchange their reproductive material. And then when they're done mating, both snails will be able to lay eggs of their own, which is another factor that helps these snails multiply very quickly. This is the egg case of a ramshorn snail. It's less than 12 hours old, and inside the egg case there are 29 egg capsules. And inside each one of these egg capsules there's a baby ramshorn snail. The adults deposit these egg cases on hard, flat surfaces, such as on the aquarium glass, decorations, and large plant leaves. They also really like to place their egg cases on the silicone in the corners of the tank. At 82 degrees Fahrenheit or 28 degrees Celsius, these ramshorn snail eggs will hatch in 6 days. And then, just 16 days after hatching, the baby snails will begin to lay eggs of their own. This is the same egg case, but the eggs are now 6 days old, and the tiny snails inside are getting ready to leave their little snail nursery and start exploring the aquarium in search of food. So in less than a month, I went from 1 snail to 30 snails, and they're all now ready to lay eggs of their own. And this high rate of reproduction is why these snails are sometimes referred to as pest snails. However, in my view, there's really no such thing as a pest snail, just as there's no such thing as a weed. These are names that we give to living things when we feel that they have little to no value. For instance, many people view dandelions as a weed because they place a greater value on the grass that makes up their lawn, so they see the dandelions as an eyesore. And yet, the dandelion has much greater value as a food product for both humans and bees. But some people prefer grass, which, when you really get down to it, has very little value other than the one we assign to it. So the term pest snail or weed is really a subjective term that has very little actual meaning. And in the typical short-sighted view of many people, a living thing only has value if we can somehow exploit it for our own good or for profit. And that's a really foolish way to look at other living things, because all creatures have a purpose and a real value to the planet as a whole. Because all living things are connected to each other, and they're all just tiny gears in a much larger machine that we call planet Earth. And just like any machine, when you start to remove tiny parts that have no obvious value, you'll eventually learn the hard way that every tiny creature, however small and seemingly insignificant, plays a very important role in the ecosystem as a whole. Yes, Ramshorn snails, bladder snails, and Malaysian trumpet snails can all reproduce at an astonishing rate, so they get the title of pest snails. But it's unfair to blame the snails and call them pests just because they've taken advantage of a tiny ecosystem that you created and you control. So be kind to the little snails, because they're not pests. They're magical creatures that can help you maintain a balanced aquarium. And if they're reproducing too quickly, then the fault is yours and yours alone. So don't blame the snails for taking advantage of your mistakes.